I welcome you. Star Wars and Star Trek, they stand above the pop culture landscape like no other franchises. You've watched them your whole life. They're old money in a world swimming with new. I'm looking at you, Marvel. But what links these two franchises like no other? I ask you to join me as we dive into it right after this. This is Unimatrix Cantina, the place to discuss the things we love about our favourite franchises and maybe some of the things we don't love so much. On the face of it, Star Wars and Star Trek have little in common, other than the fact they have star in their name and are set mostly in space. Let us look a little closer though. Can we find the similarities between them and how they've been caught in each other's gravity for over 40 years? Stick around to the end of the video and I'll let you know which franchise I think has had the biggest influence on the other, and why. We have to go back to the 1960s to witness the birth of Star Trek. Back when George Lucas was still learning his trade in film school, Roddenberry was pitching Star Trek to TV executives. After a failed pilot, unusually NBC commissioned a second pilot. This lifeline was crucial, not only for the series itself to be born, but for the creation of one of the most iconic characters in TV and movie history. I give you James T. Kirk. In 1965, Star Trek was commissioned by NBC and was first aired in 1966. While it was popular with a select group of devoted fans, the show ended in 1969 after 3 seasons and 79 episodes. That was the end of Star Trek. Only it wasn't. In the 1970s, the series was syndicated and proved popular with audiences both old and new. By the late 1970s, a proposed weekly Star Trek II series was in the works. New characters were to be introduced, joining James Kirk on a second 5-year mission on board the Enterprise. This proved to be a stillborn project and was shelved before it could enter production. We'll come back to this though, because around this time, something big was brewing in the desert. In 1971, while Star Trek was biding its time in syndication, George Lucas was attempting to get the rights to film an adaptation of Flash Gordon. He was unsuccessful in this. However, it led him to start developing his own original space opera. In 1973, after he completed American Graffiti, George started in earnest to develop his new space opera. This would be more optimistic in tone compared to his earlier attempt in the sci-fi genre, THX 1138. After many drafts, the screenplay was completed in early 1976. George was pulling together a number of genres into one piece of work. Although his influences were numerous, what he stirred together in this hot pot of deliciousness was something that just hadn't been seen before. It was unique. The problem with unique though is sometimes nobody else gets it. During production, many of the cast and crew didn't take it seriously. Even the studio were getting uneasy, with delays in production and rising costs. George was put under increasing pressure to get the movie wrapped. However, in 1977, the movie was finally released. By the end of the year, it had been shown in over 1,000 theatres in the US. It was soon a massive hit internationally, no doubt lifted by the news reports of its incredible success in America. But why was it so successful? For me, there are 3 key reasons. First one, story. It was a great story, fun with likeable characters that grew as the story progressed, an iconic villain. Real stakes were quickly established. Look, I could go on for hours about the story, and I probably will in a future video. Safe to say that Lucas nailed the story. Secondly, the soundtrack. The soundtrack is one of the most important elements of this film's success. In the 70s, it would have been so easy to fall into the trap of doing futuristic electronic music. Thankfully, Lucas knew this and hired the composer John Williams. The soundtrack that he composed is iconic and really becomes the emotional centre of the film. It's one of the elements that makes the film so watchable even 40 plus years later. Finally, the editing. I was tempted to put the special effects in as a third reason, but I think it's too obvious. As great as they were, and they still hold up pretty well for the most part today, I think the editing has a greater, if less noticeable impact on the success of the movie. The editing keeps the pace just right through the film. Just take the opening scenes as an example. They quickly establish what's happening. A space battle that quickly becomes a boarding. We see the tension and apprehension of the rebel troops prior to the ground battle beginning. And yes, that entrance from Vader. Within 5 minutes, we've established the situation, the main antagonist, one of the protagonists, we know the bad guys are after something, and the droids have it. Barely a word of dialogue has been spoken. This quick establishment of what is going on hooks you in, and that is down to the expert editing. Star Wars was a big success, but what legacy did this success create? Star Wars smashed box office records and caused a cultural shift. All of a sudden, the movie studios realised there was money to be made from space films. After Star Wars, from the late 1970s to early 80s, you see a glut of sci-fi and fantasy films released, including something called Star Trek, the motion picture. Throughout the 70s, Gene Roddenberry had been working with Paramount on the development of a Star Trek movie. However, this development was troubled, and the scripts developed never gained approval. Eventually, in 1977, just prior to the release of Star Wars, the Star Trek movie was cancelled. Production shifted to making a new Star Trek TV series. Cast and crew were hired, only to be laid off shortly afterwards. The reason? Paramount wanted to make a space movie. Star Wars had been released at this point, to incredible success, and the Paramount executives wanted a piece of that pie. Luckily for them, they already had ready-made IP in their catalogue. They quickly switched gears from producing a TV series to making a movie again. They adapted one of the scripts from the cancelled TV series into something suitable for a movie. By August 1978, filming commenced, and by December 1979, it was ready for release in North America. It opened to great success, beating the 3-day weekend box office record of Superman, and even topping the 1978 re-release of Star Wars domestically. A surprising turn of events when you consider the money generator the Star Wars franchise would later become. However, the movie opened to mixed reviews, owing more to Kubrick's 2001 than Star Trek in its tone. Even today, when compared to the rest of the Star Trek body of work, it stands somewhat alone in its approach to the Star Trek universe. There can be no doubt, though, that the success of Star Wars brought new life back into Star Trek. Does Star Trek succeed if it just remained a TV show? Do the iconic characters of Kirk, Spock and McCoy endure and become seared into the public consciousness? Highly unlikely. Orbit between these two franchises is established in the 70s with the release of Star Wars and Star Trek the Motion Picture. Nobody knew it at the time, but this was the start of a golden age. Throughout the 80s, 90s and early 2000s, both franchises continued to be developed and grow. Star Trek, with a series of movies released to a mixture of critical and financial success, good, bad, and even the exceptional. Alongside those movies, a series of TV shows such as The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine and Voyager were on the air. Many would classify this as a golden age for Star Trek, with new content coming thick and fast. There was seemingly no stopping the Star Trek juggernaut. Over in the Star Wars universe, things went along at a much slower pace. After the release of the final part of the original trilogy, Return of the Jedi in 1983, things went very quiet for moviegoers. Yes, there were numerous books, comics and even animated series released in this period, which catered for a strong core of the fan base. For everyone else, they had to wonder if they'd ever see a return to this incredible universe. We knew there was another story to be told. The very fact that Star Wars was later retitled Episode 4 A New Hope made it clear there were 3 more chapters to be seen. In 1999, Lucas released the first part of the prequel trilogy, re-energizing the franchise and introducing it to a whole new generation of fans. By 2005, and the release of the final part of the prequel trilogy, Revenge of the Sith, Lucas and Star Wars were done as we knew it. In the same year, the last burning ember of the Star Trek universe was snuffed out. Enterprise, the prequel TV series, was cancelled after its 4th season. This, coupled with the critical and box office failure of 2002's Star Trek Nemesis, served as a final nail in the coffin for the Star Trek universe. By the mid-2000s, both franchises had stalled and didn't appear to be going anywhere fast anytime soon. They both needed fresh blood and fresh ideas. Be careful what you wish for, they say. Indeed. In 2007, Paramount hired a new creative team to head up the Star Trek movie franchise. J.J. Abrams, who produced with writers Roberto Orci and Alex Kurtzman, charged with reinvigorating the franchise. The 2009 Star Trek reboot was a bold statement. It recast the original characters and changed the timeline. While risky, it was a smart choice in the face of it, allowing them to continue with already well-established characters, but allowing for new stories to be told without completely rewriting canon permanently. Star Trek had certainly dabbled in alternative timelines before, so it wasn't without precedent. Commercially and critically, it was seen as a success, though some of the long-term fan base may have been sceptical due to the action-based nature of the film, forgoing many of the franchise's more cerebral elements. However, this was a common thread for most of the feature films, as they had to appeal to a mass audience, in contrast to the TV shows that could afford to dive into weightier subjects more commonly appreciated by the hardcore fan base. Certainly, J.J. Abrams and his team had left the story of Star Trek in a potentially exciting place. The opportunity to create new and engaging storylines and character arcs were there for the picking. The next step would be crucial. This step came in 2013 with the release of Star Trek Into Darkness. Never was a title more apt. Unfortunately, instead of exploring an exciting new story, they decided to revisit an old one. The Wrath of Khan is probably the greatest of all Star Trek films, so you can see why there would be a temptation to revisit that well. While it may seem these films are linked, Into Darkness is more of a retelling of the story's space seed from the original series. In the Kelvin timeline, Kirk does not find Khan and his followers on board the drifting SS Botany Bay. Rather, it appears Admiral Alexander Marcus does. This change means the story does play out differently, and while there are interesting concepts at play, it feels like a missed opportunity. It tries to be clever by replaying the most emotionally charged scene from the Wrath of Khan, the death of Spock. Only they reverse the roles of Kirk and Spock. The decision to lean so heavily on imitating the death of Spock's scene causes the movie to stumble. This is compounded by saving Kirk before the end credits roll. Into Darkness had other problems. It felt more Star Wars than Star Trek at times. The scene of Scotty discovering the secret base orbiting Jupiter felt so much like a Star Wars scene that it wrenched me out of the movie on my first viewing. Listen to the music early in the scene, and you might get what I mean. Considering that JJ was a self-confessed Star Wars fan that knew little about Star Trek, this shouldn't be a surprise. These elements being thrown into Star Trek alongside the undoubted commercial success of the franchise's reboot were a clear calling card to Disney that he was the man to reboot a loved but aging franchise. In 2012, Lucasfilm was bought by Disney. It wasn't long before JJ was given the task of re-energizing the Star Wars universe to recreate his success with Star Trek. Surely, this was the job he was born for. Star Wars The Force Awakens was released in 2015, once again to critical and commercial success. In fact, that commercial success was off the charts, eventually clocking in over $2 billion. The film was reminiscent of his first Star Trek outing, in that it touched on similar themes to previous films of the franchise, prompting some to comment that it was just a reboot of A New Hope. While this may be a valid argument, there is no doubt that there were some interesting concepts touched upon. JJ also left some interesting threads dangling that excited the fans of what could come next. Certainly, J.J. Abrams and his team had left the story of Star Wars in a potentially exciting place. The opportunity to create new and engaging storylines and character arcs were there for the picking. The next step would be crucial. Wait, what? Certainly, J.J. Abrams and his team had left the story of Star Trek in a potentially exciting place. The opportunity to create new and engaging storylines and character arcs were there for the picking. The next step would be crucial. Didn't I say that already? Yes, I did. This is one of the strong parallels between the two franchises in recent history. J.J. Abrams' approach has left similar marks and missed opportunities upon both. For Star Wars, that next step was The Last Jedi. This film was divisive to say the least. I'll save my commentary on that for another day. What is clear from the next step of each franchise is neither had a cohesive plan beyond make movies and milk the cash cow. If Star Trek had developed a 3-film arc with some fresh ideas true to the series, like Star Trek 2, 3 and 4 had, there might have been some solid themes to build the franchise into. Likewise, after The Last Jedi, it was clear there was no plan for Star Wars. This was even more surprising considering the history of the franchise. Even when developing the original Star Wars story, Lucas knew there was a bigger story to tell related to the events of A New Hope. The Empire Strikes Back and the Return of the Jedi were part of the same narrative and formed a true trilogy. Following that, Lucas then developed the prequel trilogy as one plan. Whatever your view on those films, nobody can deny they were the product of one clear vision. In a period of 10 years from 2009 to 2019, we saw two of the most adored franchises in history reborn to great fanfare, only to see a series of missteps befall both of them, leading to conflict among the fan bases and uncertain legacies for both franchises on the big screen. While Disney have announced new movies for Star Wars, little is known about them at the time of this video. We can only hope that Disney have learned some lessons from the sequel trilogy and are developing a clear plan for the future. Star Trek is in more trouble as far as I can see. The 4th film of the Kelvin timeline appears to be stillborn. Although rumours surface from time to time that something may happen, it seems unlikely. There are other films proposed, including an R-rated film, which would be a surprising departure for what had been until recently a family-friendly franchise. While things have gone quiet on the cinematic front, it doesn't mean Star Wars and Star Trek have gone quiet. Star Wars had always been a story for the cinema. The holiday special doesn't count. Let's just forget that ever happened. Although there have been a couple of attempts to bring the universe to the small screen through different animated series, Droids and Ewoks in the mid-80s and Clone Wars in the early 2000s, they didn't last long. Where Star Wars was undeniably the big dog between it and Star Trek in the movie world, Star Trek was the clear titan of the small screen. From the original 60s series and its endless reruns, to the successful reboot of The Next Generation in the late 80s. This domination would continue into the 90s and early 2000s with the spin-offs DS9, Voyager and Enterprise. After the release of The Revenge of the Sith, Lucas returned his attention back to animation with a retelling of the Clone Wars. The series had its critics and was cut short. It is worth a watch though, especially after a final season was commissioned by Disney. It ties the end of the series with the events of Revenge of the Sith. Some of the best Star Wars out there. Disney continued to dabble with animation with the release of Rebels and Resistance. These were aimed at the younger generation and had varying degrees of success. 2017 marked the return of Star Trek to the small screen with Discovery, a show set with a brand new crew and centred around a new character who wasn't the captain, as was traditional in the Star Trek landscape. This was followed in 2019 with a landmark for Star Wars. The Mandalorian was released as a live-action show set in the Star Wars universe. Like Discovery, it forewent tradition by focusing not on the Jedi, but by following a new character, Din Djarin, a Mandalorian just trying to make his way in the galaxy. One of these shows was successful in its mission. One was not. For now, I'll let you make up your own mind which is which. With Picard and Lower Decks being released in 2020, and 2 new series, Strange New Worlds and Prodigy in the works, the Star Trek TV juggernaut looks like it will continue on for the foreseeable future. Whatever your thoughts on the latest shows, and we all have some strong ones I suspect, there appears to be no stopping Star Trek on the small screen for now. Star Wars looks like it's doubling down on the small screen, the Bad Batch continuing where Clone Wars left off, and a host of new shows announced including Kenobi, Ahsoka and the Book of Boba Fett among others. Both Star Wars and Star Trek continue in each other's orbit. Having delved into the history of these franchises, it's clear to see many of the similarities between them. Star Trek showed that stories set in space could be fun for the family, but also asked some deeper questions of ourselves. Star Wars showed that space adventures could appeal to a mass audience, and like Star Trek could have an enduring appeal. Star Wars dragged Star Trek into its cinematic orbit on the back of its huge success. Both franchises have experienced reboots that showed great promise, only to falter when it came to the crunch. Where one started its life as entertainment for the small screen, the other as a quintessential movie-going experience, both have crossed over into the other's domain with some success. Today, both are finding their steps in a new era, an era where the lines between movies and TV series are becoming blurred. So which franchise do I think has had the biggest influence on the other? Star Trek was the first to be created, and the first to generate such a loyal fan base. However, there's no doubt that the success of Star Wars dragged Star Trek further into the public consciousness and cinematic success. If Star Wars didn't happen, would Star Trek still exist? Possibly, but would it have been a breakout success? It's hard to be sure, but it does seem highly unlikely it would kickstart the entire franchise to the level it's at now. Yes, The Next Generation was a global success, but that was on the back of several movies that simply wouldn't exist if Star Wars hadn't come to life. As a fan of Star Trek and of Star Wars, I am forever grateful that George Lucas pulled out his typewriter, persevered through multiple drafts, battled through desert filming, and danced the dance with movie executives to produce the most culturally impactful movie to grace the cinematic landscape. George Lucas, we thank you. You made it this far into the video, thank you so much. You're a rarity and it makes you awesome. If you liked the video and want to see more, please subscribe and hit the bell so you can get notified every time I post a video. Anyway, closing time at the Unimatrix Cantina. Time for you to go and take your droid with you.